Hi, students. Thank you for joining me again in our virtual classroom. We're going to dig into Unit 2 today. Let's take a minute and if you want to get out your homework that you did on Friday with Dr. Sowell. I'm Ms. Fassler and I teach at Marshfield High School in Marshfield, Wisconsin. Last week on Friday with Dr. Sowell, if you were doing the live video classes, you took a look at biomes and you learned about how biomes are, the pattern of biome distribution is largely determined by climate, which is largely determined by latitude. And I just wanted to share with you that while Dr. Sowell is down here in Florida sweating it out, I'm at about 45 degrees north latitude up here in northern Wisconsin. And we had about 8 or 10 inches of snow yesterday. So I know there was some severe weather around the country. I hope everybody is doing well. And thanks for hanging in with us as we start to get really deep into the review for our exam on Monday, May 18th. What we're going to focus on today is really this skill set that is common to both of the two free response that you're going to answer. Although as we go through a couple practice questions, we'll look at designing an investigation. I know that's one that makes students a little bit nervous, but you'll have some more homework practice on that tonight. And we'll look at some solutions as well. So go ahead and grab that homework that you did on Friday where you looked at a worm invasion. So there was a free response question that you answered where you had to support Dr. Tate's assertion that the leaf litter is critical to the survival of local forest plants and include in your discussion the role of leaf litter in a deciduous forest ecosystem. So one of the best pieces of advice that your teachers were probably giving you and Dr. Sowell and I as your virtual teachers can give you is that when you read that prompt of the FRQ, don't just start puking out the first thing that comes into your mind. Take a minute because the writing will go rather easily. Take a minute and process what that question's asking you to do. And the first thing I would do if I were reading this is I would in my head kind of go through, what do we mean by leaf litter? Oh, that's all those leaves that are sitting on the deciduous forest floor. They lose their leaves. And how does having those leaves on the forest floor help in the plants of the deciduous forest ecosystem? So you could talk about a number of different things here, and I'll kind of go through these bullets of which were the most common kind of answers students would give. Leaf litter is critical to the survival of forest plants because, and I'm guessing a lot of you went with this first bullet point, maybe because we had just recently reviewed biogeochemical cycles and food webs and food chains. So you got that idea that that leaf litter stores nutrients and that it's going to be recycled or decompose and release those nutrients and make them available for the growth of plants. You could have also talked about the benefit of that leaf litter preventing soil erosion and loss of plant nutrients, providing shelter for seedlings to grow, absorbing and retaining water, which is important for plant growth, or kind of similar to that, assisting in the infiltration and percolation and thereby preventing runoff of needed water. The next part of the question should have been pretty easy. 3 seems like kind of a lot, but we had to describe 3 abiotic changes that would likely result if the exotic worms consumed all that leaf litter in the first year. They were that invasive species that just went to town and consumed all of that leaf litter. So there's a ton of different things you could say. You want to make sure that you don't just necessarily say something changes, but indicate how it might change. You could make an argument for either increase or decrease in soil fertility, changes in the nutrient level of the soil, changes in soil temperature, that should be pH of the soil, increased rates of evaporation because I'm not holding that soil moisture in, reduced shelter area for animals that might live there. So all kinds of different things that you could have said would have abiotic conditions that would have changed. And then we get into a little bit of the experimental design. This invasive worm question's a little bit older, and although it's some good practice on experimental design, I don't think it's maybe quite as tight, or it's not it's not guiding you real directly into that experimental design. And I think some of the practice that we give you, we're going to try to be a little bit more targeted. But let's see what you came up with here. The article talked about this native siltgrass. So a hypothesis could be that increasing the density of worms would increase the biomass of siltgrass. My independent variable would have been the density of worms. That's the variable that I controlled. My dependent variable in this example would have been the biomass, or how much silt mass grew, silt grass grew as a result of that. Remember that your experimental control is always your sample group that is not subjected to that independent variable. So my control would have been a plot with no worms. And then if you look at other aspects of the experimental design that you could have talked about in designing your controlled experiment, we went through this in one of the earlier sessions about the idea of a large number of treatments. So how many test plots did I have? I want to replicate that. I maybe want more than one plot where each variable is being tested, and I can then average those results. How many times am I sampling each plot? How long am I going to let the experiment run? Maybe something about how I would actually measure the biomass of siltgrass. So all other good components you could have included in your experimental design. Awesome. So now that we've got kind of that introduction to biomes, we're going to move into unit number 2 on the living world, understanding biodiversity. And we've divided unit 2 into 2 review sessions. I'll cover the first half of those learning targets today, looking at what biodiversity is and why it's important and how we measure it. And then tomorrow, Dr. Sowell is going to go into disruptions to biodiversity. And you'll notice that there will be a number of points throughout our lesson today that I'll kind of reference. Oh, if this disruption would occur, what would happen? Those are the things that you'll address tomorrow. So where are we going today? Well, we're still in this big idea that we were in unit 1 on interactions between Earth systems, that the Earth is this one big interconnected system. And we're going to look at that in terms of different levels of biodiversity. And in terms of skills, like I said, we're all really going to focus on this concept explanation. We'll do, as always, a little bit of environmental solutions, and your homework will give you a chance to practice again with experimental design. So let's get started. Where are we going today? What is ecological tolerance? This should look sort of familiar to you. It's one of our, one of the first learning targets in this section, but I threw it up at the beginning because we're really going to use this to help us understand some of those learning targets that follow. We came back and looked at this big idea in Unit 8 when we reviewed it. So if you watched any of those, or when we taught the information from Unit 8, so if you watched any of those videos, this should look pretty familiar to you. This is a really important diagram for me to be able to use to explain why changing the abiotic component of an ecosystem is going to impact biodiversity. That's where we're there. That's how we're going to apply this idea to explaining a bigger environmental concept. So remember that each species has a set of environmental conditions in which they can survive and reproduce, sort of those conditions that they're best adapted to through natural selection. And remember that this x-axis here can really be any abiotic factor. When I look at my essential knowledge statements, they talk about things like salinity, or maybe if in our worm invasive species question, it would have been the amount of nitrate or phosphate that was in the soil available for plants. So any abiotic condition can be, I can talk about changing an abiotic condition and how the living organisms are going to respond to that change. And remember, when we look at this diagram, this is what I really want to focus in on here. And the misconception that a lot of students have, that the minute I get a little bit outside that optimal range, that everything dies. And we'll model together and walk through a question at the end where we put this into practice. But remember, although I have this optimal and preferred niche, the temperature, pH, salinity, dissolved oxygen, where that species has evolved to really be successful, a slight change in any of those abiotic conditions doesn't necessarily kill off the entire population. I can have this zone of intolerance, but what we often see students do is indicate that things die, when in fact, small changes in those abiotic conditions are just going to mean that that organism is unable to thrive and reproduce at their maximum potential. So that's a misconception that a lot of students have, and they would say in a response that things die the minute they get outside that optimal range. So kind of good verbiage for you to have as you describe the ecological idea of ecological tolerance, and we'll come back and apply this in a bit. So let's go back to the first learning target of the unit and look at a review of what biodiversity is in general. Remember, when you first studied in Unit 2, we talked about biodiversity being represented by these different levels. I can have ecosystem diversity. That's really what you looked at with biomes in the last virtual session, right? That we can have polar, temperate, and tropical ecosystems. And the greater the number of different ecosystems I have, the greater the different variety of habitats and resources that I have. I can have species diversity. I can have lots of different species, and the greater my richness, my species richness or number of species I have, the more I can hone in on those specialized niches. And finally, I have genetic diversity. Within my population of little chipmunks, I want a large number of individuals within that species, because the more individuals I have, the greater the different allele combinations, the greater genetic diversity I have, and the greater the likelihood that I'm going to have randomly by mutation an advantageous trait that may prove beneficial if there is some ecosystem disruption. So let's take a step back and dial in on each of these in a little bit more detail. We're going to go to genetic diversity first. So why is genetic diversity important? Well, remember, genetic diversity is the raw material of natural selection. It's all of those changes in allele combinations that are going to give the right trait for the right environmental condition that may happen in the future. It's also important because the death of individuals in a population can happen really quickly. But remember that that genetic diversity is the sum of, it could be millions of years of adaptation of that individual, of the individuals within that population. So here's a good example. We've kind of been talking about elephants in terms of an endangered species. Notice I'm wearing my elephant garb today. So when we track African elephant populations, we can see that they have gone from 200,000 individuals down to over a couple of decades down to below 500,000 individuals. Each of those individuals represents a unique gene combination that once those individuals are gone, I will never have that specific unique gene combination back again. And we don't know what kind of environmental conditions might prove beneficial 10 years, 100 years. How can we predict 10,000 years, 100,000 years from now, what trait might prove beneficial to an individual, to a population? So we want lots of individuals, lots of genetic variation within that population. So that's getting at the value of genetic diversity. And you may remember when you studied this that you related that idea to what we call a population bottleneck. So the idea here is that as I have a decrease in population size due to some type of disruption that you'll look at tomorrow, I have a decrease in genetic diversity. I think we're okay with that idea right now. In other words, I have a decrease in the size of the gene pool, or a decrease in the number of different alleles within a population. Well, ecologists have called this a population bottleneck because we want to visualize all that original gene pool, all this unique gene combinations of every individual chipmunk in that population. And when for either an anthropogenic or natural reason, that population shrinks, and we turn that bottle upside down and we shake out just a few individuals that were lucky enough to survive. Only a quarter of that original elephant population survived. And so they took with them only a quarter of the original gene pool, the original genetic diversity within its population. And so if I start off, each of these little different colored marbles represents a different allele within that population in the gene pool. If I start off with all this genetic diversity, and by chance, a small number of those individuals survive, even though my population by numbers may recover. We could see that elephant population was starting to creep back up a little bit, but remember, they have lost the genetic variation, a quarter of their population, a quarter of their genetic diversity. So now that we kind of understand this idea, we've reviewed it, we get the importance of genetic diversity and what can happen when I lose genetic diversity. It can result in a population bottleneck. Well, let's see if we can apply this or frame this in a real situation of a real population of organisms. So the whooping crane are kind of a cool story. They're a beautiful, large, majestic migrating bird. Their wingspan is over 5 feet tall. And they had a very healthy population prior to a lot of ecosystem disruptions. Their population went from over 10,000 to just about 15 whoopers left in the wild by 1940. One of the main causes for the decline in many migratory birds, obviously habitat disruption, but the use of lead shot for hunting. That lead ends up in the aquatic ecosystems where many migratory birds feed, and they ingest that heavy metal neurotoxin. So you can see that the population is rebounding. They are coming back due to really concerted efforts on wildlife management, on wetland management, as well as captive breeding programs. This is just a cute picture showing people working at the International Crane Foundation raising chicks in captivity with the goal of releasing them into the wild. And what the workers do is they put themselves they clothe themselves from head to foot in this kind of white background, so hopefully they sort of blend in, and they use a little mama whooping crane puppet so that when they interact with the chicks, so that the chicks aren't imprinting on the human population, because the goal is to release them back in the wild. Well, one of the reasons we care about that population bottleneck, one of the direct consequences of that bottleneck is oftentimes that population will suffer anatomical abnormalities because of an inbreeding depression. And in the case of whoopers, they actually have, you may have heard of scoliosis. It's a curvature of the spine, something that many people in a human population would deal with. And it simply means that when I lose that genetic diversity and I have only a small number of individuals, this is all of the whoopers in captivity. So my choices for what individuals I'm breeding and mating is limited. And I often have to breed or mate closely related individuals. And I tend to have a reduction in the robustness of the population because of the likelihood that those harmful traits are going to become more predominant, that idea of an inbreeding depression. So let's move from genetic diversity to species diversity. Why is it important to have many different kinds of species within my ecosystem? And here I show you just a smattering of a variety of insect species within a certain ecosystem. So the term species richness simply refers to the number of different species. And I want a lot of different species because each of these insects, for example, is going to have a very different role. Some of them might bury dung. Some of them might pollinate. Some of them might control populations of other pests or serve as food for wildlife. So the more different species I have, the greater my species richness, the more I can hone in on those specialized niches and make sure that I'm using resources efficiently. One of the things that we want to understand about ecosystem diversity, if we go back up to that biggest level, we have genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity, is the greater the diversity I have, the more resilient my ecosystem is, the greater its ability to bounce back from some type of disruption that you'll look at tomorrow with Dr. Sowell. So the idea of ecosystem services supports the maintaining of ecosystem diversity. Remember, these ecosystem services are these life support systems that ecosystems provide for us for free. They have huge economic value. You probably remember throughout the year answering free response prompts that asked you about an economic value of maintaining forests or coral reefs or whatever ecosystem it is that we're talking about. And remember that if we degrade these ecosystems, we're going to have to foot the bill for those services that they provide for free. There are 4 categories of ecosystem services. Some of these get kind of hard to remember. And our hope is that we can conceptualize the idea of an ecosystem service in general, and try to give specific examples, and understand what these different categories are. So I put them all in a chart here so it's a little easier if you need to go back and review them. Let's just quickly run through these and see if we can give an example of an ecosystem that fulfills each of these ecosystem services, things we get for free. Well, there's provisioning. They provide for us. They give us food. They give us clean drinking water, medicines, lumber products, all of these valuable products that we get directly from ecosystems. So we have a lot of wetland ecosystems in Wisconsin, and one of our major exported agricultural crops is cranberries. And cranberries grow in those wetland ecosystems, and they need a lot of clean water. So we have a incentive to maintain wetland ecosystems for all of the economic benefit we get from the food that we harvest from them. We have regulating ecosystem services. These are processes that moderate natural phenomenon, like how forests store vast amounts of carbon. The soil stores vast amounts of carbon. So we have an economic incentive to maintain these because they provide these services for free. Pollination of insects. So an example of that would be coral reefs, and the fact that they buffer storm damage, they absorb some of incoming waves. And if they aren't there, we have to spend a lot of money building some kind of artificial infrastructure that's going to accomplish the same role. Often underrated, but very at the heart of those of us in the apes community, are these cultural ecosystem services. Oftentimes we don't ascribe as high an economic value to these. I would argue they can be assigned an economic value. This idea of biophilia, or the well-being that I get when I am able to go out and bird watch and hike through the woods and hear wild animals and interact with nature, get back to our roots. The idea that many indigenous people have a cultural tie to the land, many Native American populations. So the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge that has economic value for fossil fuels, but we don't put a price tag on the economic value to the indigenous populations that depend on the caribou that might migrate through that area. And then supporting ecosystem services. Again, they support us by performing underlying processes, much like tropical rainforests do, by providing us with oxygen to breathe through the process of photosynthesis. And we'll get a chance to practice this in one of our questions in a minute. So let's do a quick timeout and check for understanding of the information we've covered so far. I think I just have 1 or 2 quick questions. Which of the following best explains how ecosystem stressors, such as wildfires, can affect biodiversity in an ecosystem? Take a minute and look at that one. How'd you do? letter C. Now, Dr. Sowell and I both understand that you're not going to have any multiple choice on your national exam. It's just the 2 FRQ, but understand that we're still practicing some content, doing quick content check with these multiple choice. And in addition to that, look how they're phrasing it. It's still the importance of being able to read carefully for understanding, because oftentimes in the question, you really have to tease out what environmental factor are they changing and how are they asking me to respond to that. So obviously ecosystems with more species diversity are more likely to recover from a disturbance. There is going to be a species that can fill that niche if that ecosystem has been disturbed. Which of the following can be used to assess the biological diversity of an area? This is the kind of thing they might even ask me in an FRQ. Boy, that'd be a great experimental design question, maybe to assess the biodiversity of 2 different ecosystems. So I might want to measure the number of each species, the species richness, but note that I also might want to do some assessment of the genetic diversity, especially if my population is small. And we often do that simply by running electrophoresis. We run a electrophoresis gel, look at the DNA. They do that a lot with animals in captivity to make sure that when they're doing that captive breeding, they're crossing individuals that have the greatest genetic diversity. All right, let's move on to our next topic, which is a really exciting one on island biogeography. So you probably remember talking about this in terms of island size and distance from mainland, the distance from the mainland. Let's take a step back for a minute and look at the origins of this theory of island biogeography. Really, the concept underlies a lot of our understanding of ecological processes today. So I'm going to take you back and show you a short clip during some of the early work of famed ecologist E.O. Wilson. And what we have to remember in our study of environmental science is that ecology is a relatively new science, and ecological concepts and principles and processes that you take for granted were oftentimes discovered not all that long ago. So join me as we go back in time to when E.O. Wilson was a young graduate student.
It was during that period of exploration, I was also thinking about why different islands have different species and different numbers of species.
Wilson tallied the number of ant species on each island, and when he plotted them against the area of the island, he noticed an interesting relationship. An island that was 10 times bigger had twice as many species. On islands elsewhere, reptiles and amphibians showed a similar relationship.
There actually was rules, mathematical regularities that nobody up until the 1960s had tried to reason out why it was like that.
Wilson discovered what he called a rule of thumb, a general relationship between the number of species on an island and its area. If this rule was indeed general, Wilson figured that if all the species were removed from an island, then the same number of species might repopulate it. But how could he test that? He suddenly remembered an extraordinary event.
On August 27th, 1883, one of the greatest volcanic eruptions ever recorded laid waste to the Indonesian island of Krakatoa. Life on the island had been completely wiped out. That tragic event made Krakatoa the perfect laboratory in which to find out how species colonized and recreated an ecosystem.
What a great story, and what a cool control group that Wilson had. Actually, I believe Mount Krakatoa just had an eruption yesterday or the day before. Go back and check on that. So let's break this model down a little bit and what the heck Wilson was talking about. He said that the number of species on the island reflects this balance between the rate at which new species colonize or immigrate to the island and the rate at which populations of established species become extinct. There's this equilibrium where those two rates intersect to determine the number of species on the island. Well, what I really want you to pull out of that video, that idea, that point that Wilson made, that this idea is sort of a rule of thumb for understanding other kinds of ecosystems. It's a really good model when we can expand that and use it to explain other situations, when this is a global concept that carries over from one scenario to another. So here's a picture of Central Park in New York City. This is an island of suitable habitat surrounded by a sea of urbanization, where most, let's say, birds of prey, there's a lot of hawks that nest in and around Central Park. So they have this nice, safe island of habitat surrounded by a sea of unsuitable habitat. And in landscapes across the world, we see this idea, this global idea, that through disruptions to ecosystems, we have fragmented habitat into these little habitat islands surrounded by a sea of inappropriate habitat where the species that preside there can't live. So let's see if we can apply this to the bigger idea of understanding biodiversity and what happens when we have loss of species because of a disruption. I want you to see if you can describe how the size of the habitat will influence the number of species, and then explain why. So let's kind of walk through this together. Here I can see I'm looking at island size, and remember, this is a habitat island. I don't want to just picture this as a literal island out in the ocean. Well, the first thing I want to do is look at my axes. Independent variable is the area of the island, and the number of species depends on the area, and that is a direct relationship. The arrow goes up in a positive way. So I could say that increasing the size increases the number of species. Explain the relationship: because there is an increase in resources, or there's greater variety of resources, or variety of habitat and niches, therefore less competition for those resources, and I can support a larger number of different species. Let's take a look at the other variable that you might have remembered talking about during your APES class this year, and that is if I change the distance from the mainland. And again, picture this mainland now as Central Park, and this is all those maybe little parks that are located miles and miles away from that an animal would have to migrate to or immigrate to. So to describe that relationship, I can say that as I increase the distance, I decrease the number of species. There is an inverse or indirect relationship, maybe because it's unsafe or very difficult for that species to move. They might have to travel through all that developed area and come in contact with predators, or they don't have shelter, or maybe that's just too big an area for that species to move. Therefore, less species will be able to immigrate or move to that other habitat island. So now let's apply this model. Hopefully you have a pretty good feel for what island biogeography is, the way we can dissect that model and make sense of it. Now, what do we do with that understanding? If you watch Dr. Sowell's really cool lecture about endangered species and preserving them in Unit 9 on global change, you were introduced to this Y2Y corridor that stands for Yellowstone to Yukon. So we have Yellowstone National Park down here up into the Yukon, a vast, I think it's a couple thousand miles. So these big habitat corridors, understanding island biogeography and what happens when we fragment intact habitat and how that leads to a loss of species. Well, now what do we do if we want to try to bring those species back or increase the population size of those different species? This is particularly important for large wildlife that need a lot of room to move. And so what we want to do is connect these fragmented habitat islands so that they can have this entire space to move. When you look at our learning specific essential knowledge statement here, we're going to come back in a day or two and really dig into the generalist specialist. So we'll revisit this essential knowledge statement. It'll make a little bit more sense to us then. All right, let's do a little check for understanding here. And then we're going to go through a guided FRQ and look at some homework. So I think I only have one or two questions on the idea of island biogeography. For which of the following reasons do small isolated islands have a greater rate of extinction than large, less isolated islands? So we have the two different variables going on here. You got to tease out a little bit when you look at your options or choices. Go ahead and take a look at that one. And hopefully you selected letter D. Small islands that are very isolated, that are very far from that big area of habitat are not more likely, they are less likely to receive migrating species. And again, even though you're not going to see a multiple choice, you're seeing a really good description of a process here that will help you understand that. So small isolated islands have a lower availability of resources. All right, let's walk through a guided practice question that kind of pulls all of the ideas together from those 4 learning targets that we looked at. So it looks like we're back to range of tolerance. The diagram below shows the pH ranges for which selected aquatic organisms can exist. A, describe how pH affects biodiversity in a freshwater ecosystem. I'm going to give you a second to either think about that one or write the answer down, and then we'll talk about it. Well, this is where I can talk about how increasing or decreasing pH is going to change the diversity of that ecosystem. And notice in the responses, I could say this either increase or decrease. I could say as pH values decrease, biodiversity decreases, lower pH, lower diversity, lower number of species that can survive there. Or I could say the opposite. As pH increases, I have more species that can survive. Notice that I could also, instead of just talking about the pH value, do more an interpretation of that. So a low pH means it's more acidic. So I could state it either way. Next, explain why increasing acidity would cause a change in species composition. So here I kind of made a claim. I said what the relationship was. Now I want to explain that relationship. So I'll give you a second to think about that one. Hopefully in your either mental or written response, you talked about the idea of range of tolerance. So here is my sample response. The organisms in the freshwater ecosystem are adapted to a certain range of pH values. And when it is outside their range of tolerance, they will be less able to grow and reproduce. Therefore, I have less species present. I don't know if a pH of 4.5 is going to kill all those trout. Remember, that's kind of a misconception or a mistake students make. So if you talk about these abiotic conditions, you really just want to focus in on how they're not going to be as successful when they're outside that optimal range. Oh, let's see, what else have we got here. Let's see if we can explain why the change in the pH to begin with. So explain how using coal to generate electricity can cause lake acidification. Got to go back to your air pollution unit or your energy unit. So hopefully you remembered to say that burning coal releases SOx. Simply having a pile of coal there, remember, doesn't release any sulfur, not until I combust or burn it. So that SOx, a primary pollutant, reacts with water to form an acid precipitation that then falls on lakes and streams or runs off into lakes and streams. And one strategy to prevent acidification of aquatic ecosystems. Be a little careful, because when we look at solutions, sometimes it might be kind of broad, and it could be, how do I prevent something from happening to begin with? Or how do I remediate that or mitigate it? So if I didn't ask it that way this time, but the question could have said, now that the lake is acidic, what can I do to repair it or put it back to normal? So be a little careful when you're reading your FRQ prompts, when you're looking at solutions. Here, I want a strategy to prevent acidification. Think about what caused it. Well, one thing I would do is replace coal burning with solar or wind power, because they do not release SOx like coal does. And if I don't have SOx, I can't have as much acid precipitation forming. Remember, I never want to just say don't use coal, because we need electricity. So I can replace or substitute that coal with something else. A lot of you also maybe went with the scrubbers, the wet scrubbers that could be used. They're the air pollution control device installed in the coal-fired power plant to remove those SOx emissions before they ever enter the atmosphere, and thus prevent the formation of the acid rain. Okay, let's take a look at what we covered today. It was a pretty good review of that first half of Unit 2. So first we looked at the introduction to biodiversity. Take a look at my essential knowledge statements here. We looked at the levels of biodiversity. We talked about the bottleneck and the importance of genetic diversity, that ecosystems that have a large number of species are more resilient, more likely to bounce back from disruptions. Remember, we're going to look at this one a little bit more later in terms of the generalist and specialist, although I checked it off there, and then simply defining what species richness is. We looked at the theory of island biogeography. We defined what that is. We know that islands can be colonized with new species arriving from other places. Remember, in the broad global application of this concept, the closer those areas, those habitat islands are, the more likely they are to be colonized, and that those new species can expand. And we're going to take a look at this again a little bit when we look at generalists and specialists in a couple of days as well. We looked at ecosystem services. We know that there are those different categories, and that they save us money by valuing those ecosystem services. And we looked at the idea of ecological tolerance, the range of abiotic conditions over which organisms can survive. So we reviewed a pretty fair amount there. I've got a great practice question for you to try, and then you'll go over this tomorrow with Dr. Sowell, just to review your task verbs. And I know Dr. Sowell addressed this a little bit. You will maybe have to look at a data set and interpret some data, but you're not going to have to perform any mathematical calculations. That was one of our 3 FRQs, and we only have the 2 this year. With the modified COVID exam, we have the experimental design main focus and the solution main focus. So all of the rest of these are those task verbs that you should be familiar with. Let me introduce the question to you. Refer to the figure or diagram below to answer the question. Notice my directions. Where explanation or discussion is required, support your answer with relevant information and or specific examples. This is that sort of because, therefore. I want to keep going and make sure I've given a complete picture. This is what happens. This is identifying a process that happens. This is explaining that process. And this is then you kind of go into the why do we care? What is the broader application? How does that help me understand a bigger environmental issue? So I'm going to identify the 2 scales on which we can measure biodiversity. We talked about 3. We're going to use the diagram to describe the difference in the biodiversity of the 2 communities. You've got different kind of species represented there. Describe a regulating ecosystem service provided by forests. And then here's where we get into a little bit more of the experimental design. An ecologist is interested in the effect that fire intensity has on biodiversity of tree communities. Describe the control group. So describe what you're going to use as your control, state it and why it's a control group. And then the diagram illustrates some of the results of the experiment. And they want you to state a likely original hypothesis based on that. So Dr. Sowell tomorrow is going to be talking about impacts, disruptions to ecosystems, and carrying through that idea of biodiversity. So should really be a nice blend in from what we talked about today. Have a fabulous rest of your Monday. Hope everybody is safe. Hang in there. We are going to be done with unit 2 out of 7 reviewing, and you guys are doing a fabulous job. See you on Wednesday.